Thank you all for coming out despite the crazy weather. This is our first UX and Data event in Brooklyn. And I think with that, we'll get right to it. Thank you, Matt, for coming and speaking tonight. So give Matt a round of applause.
All right. I think there was supposed to be double the amount of people here today, so we're a small enough group that I think we can actually pause and ask questions or make comments if you have anything that's on your mind. And today we're going to be talking about more or less the process that I and the rest of the team at The Pudding uses to make our articles. Has everyone heard of The Pudding or seen it before, any of the articles? Okay, we're going to go through a few examples. But yeah, this is our editorial process. Cool, so when you think about the articles that we make, and I'll show you a few examples, generally I like to start with a question. And a lot of the times people will come to us with pitches, and I know I myself have found myself going down the path of doing this thing, which I don't recommend doing, is starting with a data set. So they'll be like, oh, there's this great data set on the internet about dog names or cat names. And wouldn't it be cool if we made a thing on the internet and told an amazing story with this data set? And I usually go the other way around. I find that really helpful. So what we do is we start with what I call a water cooler question. So if you work at a company, you might find yourself at the water cooler debating something with your colleagues, or over drinks at a bar, or over coffee at a coffee shop. And these are some of the questions that we have tried to answer in the articles that we've written. So everything that's a little bit more pop culture related, like how many musicians have made it big over the past few years, to something that's a little bit more politically divisive, such as how does abortion clinic accessibility vary by geography, which we'll cover today. How many babies are born after major disasters? There's a lot of music projects on here. How do you qualify music as punk? So these are the types of things that we really like doing, because there isn't really a clear answer to any of these. In fact, this is discourse that has been going on for a long time because the answer isn't clear. And what we try to do is we try to find data sets or ways to visualize that discourse and improve it in some way. So can we actually make the conversation around how many musicians have made it big easier to have with data or visuals? All right, so that is where we start. And then the type of content that we try to shy away from is really communicated well with this metaphor. And this is something that I read like back in the day, 2010, so this is 8 years old. And I really like it in terms of how we think about the articles that we write versus what you might see on 538, for example. So it's the idea of stock and flow. And flow is kind of what you see around the news cycle. It's the posts, it's the tweets, it's the stream of content that you kind of have to publish if you're a media entity to remind all your followers that you still exist. And then the opposite of that is more or less what we try to do from a content perspective. And it's the stuff that we hope, if published today, will be just as relevant 2 years from now. So we want to create an article around music or film or politics that doesn't have a shelf life, or it has a shelf life and maybe it's very long. So we're going to try to avoid articles that are around the news cycle that, if published, no one will care about them a week later. So if we're writing anything on basketball, we don't want to do anything on the NBA Finals. We want to do a thing on every NBA Final. Next slide. Okay. So the thing that we call this idea of stock content around divisive questions and improving discourse are visual essays. And you can see most of the articles at pudding.cool, which is the URL that we snagged. Next slide. All right, these are a bunch of examples. We don't have the audio hooked up for this one, so let's skip this one. Okay, so this is an example of a chart that we made around slang. And the idea here was using Google to look at what slang is being used by the kids these days by looking at search interest around what is the meaning of X. And the idea that we kind of started with was, okay, we take a word like selfie, which is more or less pervasive in the American lexicon, and then take newer slang like Netflix and chill and see at what point does it reach a peak search interest relative to selfie. So if you feel bad about not knowing what broccoli is slang for, that's okay because it never got as big as selfie. So that's how we were like mentally thinking about this from a model standpoint. Next slide. This was another article that we worked on actually with the American Society of News Editors. Every year they had been surveying newsrooms on the diversity of their teams, both race and gender. This chart right here was on gender. Actually, can you click this one? Let's see if it'll open up in Chrome. Is there like a hotspot? Awesome. Yeah, so this was the gender breakdown of, I think, around 100 newsrooms by the percent of their overall newsroom by gender. And then if you click this tab here, we have it by leadership. And then we don't have to go through all the charts, but again, we're trying to take this data set and talk through something that hopefully, if updated every year, would stay in the Google search rank for diversity of newsrooms. Yeah, let's go back to this. Next slide. Let's go through one. Next slide. Okay, this one was on pop lyrics, and can you open up this one? So the idea here, and scroll down, was to tackle the idea of, oh, is it not? There we go. The idea of how do you think about the repetitiveness of lyrics. So what our contributor did was used the compression algorithm that is used when you zip files on pop lyrics. So he explains the compression algorithm right here. So this was a novel way to improve the discourse around the repetitiveness of pop lyrics. So what he's doing is using this compression algorithm on Cheap Thrills by Sia and saying, okay, you can actually compress the lyrics down to a much smaller file size, and then uses that mental model on a lot of songs. So if we keep scrolling all the way down, keep going, he ends up showing these charts around like, here's where an average song compresses to, this is Cheap Thrills, this is this essay, because obviously it doesn't have a chorus or verses, so it's not very compressible. But these are like the charts that we generally produce, and we usually have animations that try to explain the idea that we arrived at. And then if you keep scrolling down, there's always like this kind of like what I call like free play. So you might not agree with what we were looking at, and we want you to be able to dive into the data as much as you can. So there's usually a lot of filters and search bars, and very rarely do we produce charts that are static. Almost everything is interactive in some way, where you can either look for other claims that we missed, or if this isn't passing your smell test, you can go into the data and say like, well, wait a minute, you really generalized all the data, and you should have considered these things. Yeah, let's go back to the thing. This one won't look good without audio. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so how do we work on all of these things, getting into the process part? Before we do that, are there any questions so far? Yeah.
I was wondering, do you track like how many people click on the buttons?
I don't, because I'm like lazy, but other people on the team have lots and lots of Google events. There are people that track how far you scroll, if you did a thing, if you didn't do a thing, and they're like, the results are always a lot worse than you think. Like no one scrolls, no one clicks, and that's okay. Most people open an article and then they close it immediately, is the dominant behavior that you have on the internet. We're actually working with a lot of contributors who are like, oh, my conclusion isn't good enough, or like, no one's gonna get to your conclusion, it's okay. You're not like Tom, well, Tom was a bad example, like you're not like you're not like a New Yorker writer, where like people are dedicated to your writing, they're gonna make it to the very end. In fact, we need to make enough visuals for you to be pulled to the end of the article. And a lot of the times, I think of it as a funnel, where it's very rarely am I expecting people to see the last charts that I make, that the most important charts go at the very top, the least important charts go at the very bottom.
So in terms of words that you just mentioned, the graphics are great and the interactive is great, but you haven't been playing as much with the words. I mean, in light of reading all the obituaries of Tom Wolfe, you know, if Tom Wolfe was writing those words, it would be much more playful. And I was just wondering why you think it's only the graphics and not the words to play with.
Yeah, I mean, generally we're trying to take on topics that struggle in prose. So if you think about prose, just period, it's hard to talk about data in prose. Like reading about data in words is mind-numbing, and so that's why we have graphics. That's why we have charts.
Have you ever read anything by Tom Wolfe?
Believe it or not, I haven't.
So
even though I went to his son's wedding.
You should.
Yeah.
So Tom Wolfe is much more like the way Vice would do an interview than the New York Times.
Yeah, I think generally our outlook on prose is that it supports a visual, and that a lot of articles that we're working on are best described in visuals, or they're depicted rather than described. So we're showing rather than telling. That's just our kind of editorial mandate. And there are certainly articles that work really well in prose, and we're trying to do ones that can't. So that's our thing. So let's keep going. We can talk about this more afterwards. All right, so the last slide said basically story plus data is really, really hard and painful. And I'm going to talk through a lot of like the pain that we've experienced doing these types of stories and the process that we've arrived on that's still not perfect. Let's go to the next slide. So the things that we're trying to mitigate in our process are severalfold. The first one is what I call Moby Dick projects, and I'm sure if anyone makes things on the internet, they have something that they kind of look at every day or every other week, and then they add a little bit, and then a year later they're still adding little bits, or they've given up. And I've had many of these projects, and what we try to do is avoid the project that goes on forever. It's this big whale of a project that you want to be perfect, and we are constantly trying to scope things down so that they don't turn into Moby Dick projects. Another thing that we're trying to mitigate is too long, too big. I've definitely become someone who just thinks, oh, if we add another chart, the article will get better. And this is never the case. It's always, we need to remove charts or remove paragraphs or remove chapters. So it is true that the too long didn't read is what we're trying to avoid. And visuals can often help the long read. We can avoid the 10,000 word New Yorker article by making the story as dense as possible into that visual, but adding more charts will not improve the article. We have this all the time. We need another week. I haven't finished the blah, blah, blah. We're constantly dealing with time extensions. The fourth bullet point we'll get into is bad ideas. There are bad ideas, there are good ideas. How do we filter those? And then I kind of like, being at the start of everything, am often someone who does late feedback, which is, I think, the most, if you haven't been on the receiving end of this, the most like unpleasant thing you can have is your boss come in and tell you, can you change everything? Or change one thing. So we try to mitigate that. We'll get into the process in a second. And what we try to support are some of the things that you might see in a typical newsroom. Deadlines are extremely important. I highly, highly recommend if you're working on editorial on the internet, if it's visual or prose driven, that you have a deadline. Supporting pairing and collaboration. We'll get into that in a minute. External and internal review is really important. We'll actually go through an article on abortion clinics that had extensive external review, and I'll talk about how we did that. And then grunt labor. So what we also want to avoid is one person doing all of the data cleaning that is just nights and weekends in Excel spreadsheets cleaning data. There are other people that can do that might enjoy it more, or might be less draining on you being also the author. So we try to support that as well. And next slide. Okay, so the first thing we'll get into from the process standpoint is idea generation. Next slide. All right, so one of the things that we do, which I've increasingly become more and more of a fan of every time we do it, is story time. So essentially every week we have one person picked on the team to come to a 1 hour meeting with 3 stories that they've fleshed out. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be just, here's an idea that I have, a couple paragraphs that describe it, and that person talks about their idea, and then every person on the team does a question round and then a reaction round. And we do this for all 3 of the stories. It usually takes about an hour. But what this does is it keeps our pipeline really healthy. Often I'll finish an article and then I don't want to look at a new article at all, because now I have to like start thinking about what I want to work on. But if every 3 or every 4 weeks I'm forced to do a story time, I have something fresh and exciting in my mind. So this has been really, really instrumental in keeping the pipeline healthy and also having just exciting ideas personally that I want to work on after I finish an article. And then once we do those story times, everything goes into the backlog. So I might actually really love an article that Amber on our team has presented. And while she might not have gotten to it because she's working on other things, I might pull that out of the backlog. So everything we work on from a storytime perspective usually ends up in the backlog in some way. And then we'll often vote on what we think our favorite ideas from the storytime were. Sometimes like our favorite ideas go to the top, our least favorite ideas go to the bottom of the backlog, but there's a repository of everything we've thought of. Next slide. And now we get into selection. We'll do Q&A after this round. So how do we pick an idea after it's been presented in storytime? When do we actually start coding things? So we want to make sure that it covers a few boxes or checks a few boxes before we actually start coding. This goes back to the thing that I said in the very beginning, which is like, does it improve discourse? And discourse usually means that it's somewhat divisive. If it's not a divisive question, why are people debating it? So we like things that have multiple sides or two sides to the idea that's going on. And then we're trying to find a data set or a visual presentation that enhances that discussion. So if it's about climate change, how are we creating a visual that helps people distill what's going on when it comes to climate change and why this idea is really complicated or divisive for individuals? And then another really important part of the rubric is that we spend a long time on these articles. And there was actually an article that we just posted on Stand-Up Comedy from Ali Wong, and that took 10 months to complete. It was like definitely a Moby Dick project, even though we tried to mitigate them. It didn't run concurrently for 10 months, but it basically kept getting created, and then we killed it, and then created it. We like dug it up from the dead, and then killed it again, and then so it just is one of those projects where if we all hated stand-up comedy, we would never want to look at that project again. So we're trying to pick topics that we're really passionate about. So for example, Amber on our team was a former marine biologist, so she happens to do a lot of science-related things. We don't want to throw her in on a topic that she has no passion about. So those are really important to keep your excitement levels high every morning looking at an article and trying to push it forward. Next slide. And so an example of this was around the geographic accessibility of abortion clinics, and we did this article last summer. And at the time, the Supreme Court was debating trap laws, specifically in Texas. So the idea was states were passing laws that restricted a clinic's ability to function, and a lot of them have been closing. And before the Supreme Court was whether these laws were constitutional. So, and the reason why whether they were constitutional would be whether they limited a pregnant patient's ability to access services. So if all these clinics were closing, the idea went that you would have to cross state lines or make like a 3-hour or 4-hour or 5-hour round trip to access these services, and this was obviously an undue burden if it was a very long distance. So this is what we wanted to research is, how long are these distances? How are people affected? And the Supreme Court's debating it, but this is something that is likely gonna go on until the abortion argument is settled in the US. So this is something that definitely had a long shelf life in our opinion. Next slide. Before I get into this idea called the pitch, any questions so far? Okay, cool. So the pitch is basically a Google Doc where the person, before they start coding anything, answers these 3 questions. So the first one is, what is the angle on the story? That's kind of self-explanatory. 2, a headline. The headline could also be an article about the article that we wrote. So what would BuzzFeed or Mashable or HuffPo or some other organization write about the thing that we made? And this also helps you enter the reader mindset. So you're not just writing this romantic, elegant headline, you're writing something that real people can understand. And then thirdly, validating it. So if we're going to do that song repetition piece, we need pop lyrics, right? And we need the compression algorithm to work. It can't just spit out garbage, right? So we need the author to actually validate that this whole thing will actually work before they start. Coding is very expensive, if anyone's a coder here. And it's hard to undo things, or it's just laborious to code charts. So we want to make sure this is a real thing before we start. That said, we have worked on lots of articles that we've killed because we didn't validate them enough. Or we actually built the thing even though we validated it, and it still ended up looking underwhelming. So these are things that will not guarantee a successful story. They'll just mitigate failure, which again is the thing that we want to avoid, is starting a project and having it kind of die on the vine. Next slide. Okay, so this was one of the first charts that we made for the clinics project, and what we did was we manually called and Googled our way to finding where the clinics were in Texas, and found out what services they provided manually, and then charted this on a map and said, okay, so these are the clinics, so the people living here are, this is a Voronoi plot, the people living here are this far from the nearest clinic, right? This is only Texas, so the problem with this chart is if you lived here, there might be actually a clinic in the southeast corner of New Mexico, which made us realize we needed to do the entire US. But this was like one of the first validation steps that we took. Next slide. So in this case for the pitch, the first one was the angle. Map clinics in Texas. We're basically gonna map all the clinics in Texas and expand into neighborhood states and understand the distance that patients would have to drive to reach them. And then the headline that we're trying to go for is how are trap laws limiting patient access to services? And then thirdly, we felt like after getting the data for Texas and the neighboring states that we had enough data that we could pretty easily answer all of these questions in the angle that we had set up. So before we actually start coding, we have this phase called pre-production. So you can kind of think of this as a movie. The person writes a screenplay, and there's like a treatment. So that's all like pre-production. But before they actually go into the studio time is very expensive. You have to have the actors and actresses on staff. You have the cameras. Money is getting burned. That's production. And we don't want to go into this phase until these all are squeaky clean. That said, there's a lot of discovery that happens in production. While you're coding, you can learn new things. But again, we want to avoid getting all the way into production, coding a whole thing, and realizing that there's not really an interesting story there. So some of the pre-production stuff that we do is who is leading the project and who is supporting it. So I already mentioned, it is extremely helpful having a team and people that you're collaborating with. If you're working on your own every morning, you can get in your own head, and the thing that you're coding might actually not be the thing. The thing in your head that you think you're coding is not the thing that's on the screen. The thing that's on the screen makes no sense. The thing in your head is like gonna win a Pulitzer. So what we're trying to do is give you external reflection of what you're actually coding. So you might be the project lead, but there's somebody supporting you in some way. And then we definitely sit down and say, okay, you're accountable for doing these things. So if you're the lead on the project, maybe you're not accountable for doing all the data cleaning or the designs. Maybe you have someone working with you on illustrations. We definitely write all those down. Next slide. And then we also decide on the scope. And this is really important for setting deadlines. We can't just say, hey, okay, you can start this project, have it done by July 31st. Well, what are you even making? Are you making 10 charts? Are you making a crazy squirrely telling object constancy article? These are really important for understanding how long things take. And we don't want to give you a deadline without knowing what you're making. So what we'll often decide on is a rough idea of how many charts or the experience that you're making. This will help us understand how long it will take. And then also from a structure standpoint, we at least have an outline of what you're doing. So for the clinic article that we'll get into in a second, we had an idea of mostly the charts that we were making before we started coding. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so once we've done all these things, then we start coding and we slot it into our editorial calendar, which is the deadline that you're hopefully working against. Next slide. Okay, cool. So lastly, we start making the thing, production. Next slide. And this is just an example of an article the New York Times had done a couple of years prior, which was on a county level, which was interesting, but certainly had limitations in the sense of counties are sometimes extremely large. Like this is an entire county. So we wanted to know really what the drive times were based on specific points within the US. And you can go to the next slide. So what we ended up doing was binning the entire US into these small hexagons. And then go to the next slide. And then what we ended up doing was looking at some of the drive times to nearest clinics. So I think these red dots are clinics. So this distance is much smaller. This distance is much larger, obviously. But this has its limitations in some ways because probably no one lives here, and these are mountains, right? We don't care that it's an 8-hour trip from the top of a mountain. So if you go to the next slide, hopefully, this is really hard to see. But these are some of the major, we basically plotted the major cities within the US. So people, I think, over 100,000. So within Lubbock, Texas, it was way more important to know what the round trip times were within this city rather than the middle of Utah, which is right there. Next slide. And some other pro tips that I have from a production standpoint is having weekly check-ins with an editor. Weekly rhythms are amazing to have. If you're not having a plan Monday, ship by Friday type mentality, you're probably thinking too long or too short. So every Monday, check in with your editor. What are you making this week? What happened last week? What am I going to have done by Friday? Work for 5 days, and then the next Monday, create a new plan by Monday, ship by Friday type plan. And this just helps you get into a regular rhythm that you think you can start structuring work within like 8 weeks, 8 one-week time frames. So when we set our deadline, we know roughly how much time you're going to get, and you can start breaking up the work into the weekly rhythms rather than like a waterfall Gantt chart of days, which doesn't make any sense from a coding standpoint for these types of projects. An external review. When you start an article, like, is someone going to be mean to you on Twitter because you didn't do your homework? So if you're working on an article that is somewhat divisive, which it should be because these are the types of articles that we're writing, what have you not considered? So as any journalist should do, go make sure all of your facts are correct, all your T's are crossed, I's dotted. And then we also have this thing that was completely stolen from Pixar, which is the Pixar Brain Trust. And there's a book called Creativity Inc., where they basically describe Pixar's entire creative process. It's the most amazing book ever if you're making things on the internet that are more long form in nature. And what they do is they have these meetings where all their best directors will go into a room and watch screenings from their younger directors or just really anything in their pipeline. And what they do is they try to give extremely candid feedback from almost a viewer standpoint to the director. And then also because they're directors themselves, they have ideas on how to address some of the challenges that this screening might have had. Maybe it didn't make any sense. Maybe it wasn't funny or sad enough. So that's the feedback loop that they're getting. But the important thing is that the director doesn't have to the person who made the film that was screened doesn't have to do anything with the feedback. They could say, yeah, I actually love my film, and all these people don't know what they're talking about, which happens all the time in our work in process meetings. I'll present an article that I'm working on, and everyone will be like, this doesn't make any sense. You're missing tool tips. And I'll be like, yeah, I know I haven't gotten to those yet, but I'm not arguing with them during the meeting. I just know to ignore that piece of feedback. But they might have had a little pearl of wisdom in there that I hadn't considered, which was like, this chart makes no sense. And in my head the entire time, I was like, this is the most brilliant chart in the world, but no one seemed to have gotten it. And maybe they didn't explicitly say that, but they didn't really talk about it at all. And that was like the hero of my entire article. So think of these work in process meetings, essentially screenings for your article. And what you're trying to elicit from the group is the most candid feedback that you can. So what I often like employing, and everyone's different, is just having them read the article silently for 15 minutes, have a Google Doc, let them write down things, and then keep your mouth shut while they talk through all the things that they wrote. People will not be candid if they feel like you're defensive with what they're saying. So I have lots of pro tips about work in process meetings that we can talk about in Q&A if you have questions, but they're extremely, extremely important for the articles that we work on. Next slide. Yeah, let's skip this one. Next slide. Okay, so wrapping it up. So those are a lot of the process things that we do right now. It's constantly evolving. We're trying new things. I mean, some projects will go for a long time, and we do all these things, and they still end up getting killed. But it's better than having nothing. So we're going to probably try to do an updated process presentation like this one at the end of every year. So stay tuned on probably Medium is where we'll publish it. And yeah, happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks. Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you. I have a question about where you get your ideas from. Your team, or do people contribute, or do you solicit people? And also, what is story time like? How are people pitching? Are there like rough models of potential visualizations?
No rough models. It is, I'll answer the easy questions first. So the actual format is just a Google Doc of probably 3 one-paragraph story ideas and probably some data sources that you're going to use. Nothing more than that. Because you don't want to go down the path of working on anything yet until you start fleshing out if this is a good idea or not. So usually it's hopefully not a data set, but a question. Like an article I'm working on right now is pop music sounding more similar today than it did 30 years ago? And like, I don't need any data to know whether that's a good article or not based on how people are responding. They're either really excited, like, oh my God, I would love an article on that, or they'd be like, yeah, that's what I call water is wet. So it's self-obvious. No one's going to be interested in reading that thing. So initially we had started with a story time around stand-up comedy, and the idea was, how do stand-up comedians get to their jokes? And we greenlit that article on that premise, but it just didn't end up really making sense later on. So we're not always perfect, but usually it's as developed as that. And then during the pre-production process, like, we go and find the data and validate it. In terms of where we get the ideas, anywhere. It's whatever you're talking about with your friends or your family, like what you're arguing about on Twitter, I don't know. It's usually something that you're really passionate about that you want to dedicate 4 to 8 weeks of your life investigating. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but actually, do you have outside people contribute, or is it just all on your?
Yeah, we take like freelance pitches all the time. I'm trying to think of one we have in our pipeline right now that I can talk about. Yeah.
Are these people like primarily designers or writers or coders or data scientists?
It depends. So we like working with people who can do everything, because then we don't have to roll up our sleeves. But we, for example, worked with this woman, Julia, who worked on an article about how film scripts are the gendered nature of, I think it was nouns or verbs, I can't remember now, but basically how scene direction treats women versus men. And she doesn't have any visual coding background, but she crushes R. So we gave her the data, because I already had it, and then she wrote all the R scripts, did all the data analysis, came up with the brilliant ideas, and I was like, great, I'm gonna make some charts now. So we find people who can specialize, and then we can complement their skills with whatever the team has, which is usually everything. So if there's someone that just does data science or someone that just does illustrations, we'll usually fill in the holes with our team. And our team is structured as Swiss Army knives, so we don't hire, or like the internal team isn't specialized at all. Like, everyone does everything. So Amber and Russell worked on the clinic project, and both of them can do everything from data analysis to code to writing. And we don't bring in anybody to help out, per se. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just one more thing. What are you using to code, like with R or?
Yeah, I mean, anything. I still don't really understand R at all. So I do a lot of my data analysis in SQL, actually. Amber uses R, Russell uses Node, Ilya uses pandas, so it's just like whatever you're comfortable with. That said, we're making things on the internet, so guess what? You need to use JavaScript. So like, there's a reality of we have to use certain skill sets because we're publishing online content. So usually JavaScript is a skill set that is really important for any project. That said, I've worked on articles that were just images. And hey, you don't need to know JavaScript to make an image on the internet. You can take screenshots of PowerPoint if you wanted to. So there's ways where you can actually do a lot of this work without writing a single line of front-end code, which is, I highly encourage people doing, is just make things rather than learn the code first and feel like you have to like make a crazy scrolly telling article to be cool on the internet. Anyway, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Do you ever run into a situation where the data set doesn't exist, or what happens if you have a great idea but can't find the data.
Yeah, so the stand-up article was exactly that. It was, Russell was like, hey, I love this Mike Birbiglia routine. And he gets to this point talking about cats, and he's like, how did he get to the point about talking about cats? So we had him, Amber, and 2 other interns all day watch comedy routines and write what they were talking about on every timestamp from the Netflix transcript. So that was a manually compiled data set. And then on top of that, we actually did laughter durations, which ended up being like the focus of the final article. So we actually collected all the data ourselves. And it was the same thing with the clinics project. There's no online registry of clinics in the US for many reasons, right? And what we did was we just called all the clinics, found out what services they offer, did the due diligence on our end, and made the data set. That said, there's things like the Pop Lyrics data set, which is just like an open source data set on the internet. You don't have to do anything. So it's usually a gamut of completely manual, make it on your own, to download it from Enigma or like Google BigQuery or whatever data set exists on the internet already. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So I see you guys you're creating you're creating data viz that has like different states. It looks like you're creating a lot of original data, like data visualizations on your own that don't really adhere to traditional data visualizations. And when you're getting deeper into the data in those data visualizations, you're breaking them down into standard like bar graphs, dot charts, that kind of thing. What do you guys like? When do you decide that this is like the kind of like graphical, interactive thing that we're going to build, and like what would be like a traditional like a bar graph or like visual data viz that you would use?
Oh yeah, I mean this is a great question. Thank you for asking it. It's really funny. I usually like build the most complicated thing ever, and then I show it to people, and they're like, "This makes no sense at all." I'm like, "Okay, bar chart it is." It's funny. I will like build the most fancy thing in the world, and it's like generally a table is what makes sense. Yeah. And actually, while I'm talking, do you mind going to Chrome and typing in "pudding microbreweries"? Because this is a good example of like a like original chart style. Like Russell, I think invented it, but I'm sure there's some person out there that can. Let's go to this article here. So he had a design problem. If you scroll down and keep going, keep going, keep going, there's going to be a little chart eventually. Here we go. Okay. So he had a design problem, which was like, well, how do you rate microbreweries throughout the US? Because there's basically 2 things people care about. One is a city's quantity of microbreweries. So if we were to say Detroit is the best place in the world or best place in the US for microbreweries, well, is it because they have lots of microbreweries? Because they have lots of really high quality beer being served. So what he did was he came up with this thing. If you drag the slider right here, you can decide like what is important to you, quantity or quality, and the chart kind of redesigns itself. And this was like the most optimal outcome for coming up with a new chart idea. Normally, it just doesn't make any sense at all, but he basically had this design problem and probably tried out a lot of things and landed on this, and it worked. Like, people were like, yeah, I get it. Like, higher is better. So on the quality scale, this is Santa Rosa, and they crush it. But normally, it doesn't typically work out that way. Since we're designing around a story, right, we have a question that we're answering. So in this case, it was, how do we settle the debate of which cities have the best microbrewery scene? We know the question that we're trying to answer, and we know that the chart needs to communicate an idea, i.e. a city ranking. So we're usually trying a lot of different designs that communicate that. But honestly, you could probably just have this right here, and you probably would have been fine. And if he wasn't so smart, we probably would have ended up just with a table. So it's usually a lot of experimentation in code. That said, in the production process, that's really, really dangerous time to experiment because you're coding, and it's really costly and takes forever. So relative to sketching things out or working in Figma or Keynote or PowerPoint. So I like to prototype in code. Other people will never prototype in code. They'll never experiment. They like sticking with tables. It's kind of up to you on how fast you can move. But we really, really like communicating the story with the best visual that we can, and sometimes that's not a standard table. And we'll try to come up with new ideas to communicate that idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you have? Okay, cool.
Yeah. So traditionally in kind of journalism, to get, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about no one going beyond the first half inch or whatever it was, then there'll be somebody who is the focus of an article who the reader is supposed to empathise with, and this is what makes you read it. There are quotes, you get their story, and you care about them. Data is kind of typically very unempathetic in that way, and certainly in some of the stories you're talking about things that people should care about, and you're taking a position of sorts, at least, on it. How do you think that you should be, or that there is a role for empathy in what you're doing? And if you do, can you talk a little bit about how data can fulfill that kind of empathetic role?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest answer is like injecting the human element is always great. Like having an interview with someone or group of people that is relevant to the piece is awesome. And we've done that in a lot of articles. This brewery one doesn't have that, but I definitely see a role for that. I'm always in my head thinking, okay, it's great to have this interview in here that one human is going to empathize with, when I'm like, okay, that's adding 600 pixels of text height, and 2% of those people are going to bounce when they see that block of text. So how are we going to keep them in the article? So it's always, I think, like a push and pull with adding in more of those roles that satisfy a certain audience, but other people just want the serotonin of the chart, the fancy chart, right? So that's one thing. And then the data empathy thing, I don't know if I have a good answer for that, because that's like such a pervasive question in the data world right now, is that data is very like, it's almost like too sterile for some of the topics that we're tackling. So with the clinic article, we're like, well, how do we humanize this? Because we're talking about people, patients that are pregnant. We're working on another article right now on birth control methods, and it's like, well, how do we humanize this? And there's ProPublica, who's invented all these. They have a library out there that can actually like programmatically generate kind of figures of people to communicate your data. But then it's like we're abstracting the data into people, which is even more weird. So I don't know. It's like we could debate this and make an article on it.
It's not something I have an answer to. It was a genuine
No, it's hard. I sometimes don't do articles because it's like so weird. I'll tell you right now, like we had a person pitch an article on the length of a human life. The length of a human life, the cost of a human life. And it's interesting because it's like, that's a weird question to ask, but it's actually a necessary question for a lot of situations. Like when you're doing environmental impact work, like how do we value human lives? Like, so it's a weird thing to work on. And how do we represent that data without feeling too sterile in our approach? And I don't know. Yeah.
So you mentioned before the different technologies, and you've done many of these. So I'm curious if you have like a repo of like best practices in data cleansing, EDA, like any of that, where we can be like, oh, I don't want to spend 2 hours when somebody's already figured out the most efficient way.
I mean, some of the technical stuff we have written up in some blog posts. If you just go to pudding.cool and go to the how-to section, there's like 2 articles written by Eli on the team who writes about generally the workflow. But we unfortunately don't have like a wiki of like, maybe we do actually. I think maybe Russell's been writing one. I don't know. Maybe it's on our GitHub actually. I will tell Kim if we have it and maybe post it to the discussion board. I don't have anything personally though, but Russell might. Does that answer your question? Okay, yes.
Yeah, so 2 things. I'm wondering if you can give us a rough idea of, let's say, like how long an article takes, not from idea generation to, but just in general of like, when you had those 3 questions answered, from then on, I know it's probably enormously based around if there's actually a data set or not, and if you have to create one like you did for the abortion article, but like just a rough idea of like how long that article took to from that, okay, here we go, to publish.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly predicated on the person too. I'll note, like, some people are really fast. Like Russell codes, like, I don't know, I just don't get it how fast he is. And some of the articles he's written in 2 weeks that would have taken me 2 months. I think my average is usually around 4 to 6 weeks. Some articles I published in 2 weeks because it was winter break and I had no distractions. But we're usually doing about 4 to 6 weeks, and we're typically juggling 1 to 2 things at a time. So rarely are you doing one thing every day, and that's almost intentional because waking up every morning and working on the same thing can get really tiresome. So it's usually 4 to 6 weeks. That said, there are articles that we take on that we know are bigger in scope, and we want to give them more breathing room. We'll say, okay, this is a 2-month or an 8-week or a 10-week endeavor, and then try to scope it that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the second part would be like, do you have postmortems? Like after you publish an article, like does the team that worked on the article? I'm diving into your process.
Yeah,
way
yeah.
too much.
Totally, no,
But
yeah.
I mean, like, do you ever have a deep conversation about what you did right and what you did wrong at the end of the day, like for each article, or you just kind of let it go and watch Twitter?
I'll be honest, I don't think we do postmortems on our own editorial, and I think we definitely do them for client work. I mean, that's how we keep the lights on. We do these articles for other companies, and we're constantly postmorteming that because we have to work together on those, and we know we can get better. In terms of like individual editorial, I think we are constantly tweaking during the process. We're like, okay, Matt started this article, but it's been 2 weeks and we haven't seen anything from him yet. Like, what's going on there? Is he going to totally let us down and spend 2 weeks like working on a fancy bar chart that should just be a not fancy bar chart? So I think there's a lot of that going on. Yeah, it's probably like every 3 weeks we have like a real talk during one of our weekly stand-ups of like, okay, what is going on in process that we're not getting right today? And then we'll go back to our like Google Doc of process, and we'll say, okay, this is too general, or this is too specific, and we'll kind of tweak it that way. But it's not as regular as postmortems.
Cool.
Yeah.
On the topic, what's the split between your own time, your own articles, and client work?
It varies. I would say it's like anywhere between 50 to 25 on average for client.
50-20, so 50-50, like your time when you're thinking of the amount of time on your team.
Yeah, it's usually 70. It's between. I would say the average is about 75 editorial because you're usually juggling 2 things or only doing editorial. But so you're never just doing client work. So it's usually you have 2 balls in the air. One is a client ball and one is an editorial ball, or just editorial balls. So that's why I say about 25% on average. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if you thought about, and you probably have, but I was wondering what your thoughts would be on, say, questions that had a hypothesis attached to them versus something that no one's ever kind of put together, a more synthetic kind of article, like you're talking about what's the cost of a human life, versus like, is there a relationship between South by Southwest and crime in Austin?
I struggle with hypothesis-driven articles because I feel like now we're getting into like op-ed territory, and we're like doing academic work, and that feels there is a role for that in journalism. Like, okay, we're going to prove something to you, reader, of what exists. But I feel like the more objective articles where here's a thing, here's data that helps us understand that thing, but we don't want to insert the reader into proving anything. I feel like then we might as well just go publish in Science like a journal. So I think most of our articles try to stay hypothesis-less. That said, the stand-up article ended up being hypothesis-driven article in the sense that it was trying to communicate an idea to the reader. It didn't start as a hypothesis article, but it definitely ended up being basically a Vox video where like, here's a thing, we want to make you believe that thing. But I like the articles that stay more objective, personally.
Right, but
Yeah.
It strikes me that the other ones, they're only interesting when the hypothesis comes out one way versus another. So you're kind of stuck with a lot of work that's not going anywhere.
Yeah, we've done the hypothesis-driven articles have died because we came in, like Russell, for example, was working on an article around epithets, and I think I'm saying that word correctly, in YouTube comments, and like we were like, yeah, YouTube comments are like the worst part of the internet, and we're gonna like prove that to the rest of the world, and it wasn't actually that bad, and we were like, he spent like 3 weeks scraping YouTube, and it was like, oh, YouTube's not so bad after all. So we didn't publish that, and that was wasted time. But the other thing is like we didn't code anything, which is really nice. And we also, like, part of our process includes failure. So we have a personal goal of 12 articles a year for the whole team. When it was 4 people, now it's 5. And the idea was that every person was publishing roughly like once every 3 to 4 months, which means if you're working on an article every 4 to 6 weeks, you have 2 articles that can fail for every 1 success article. So that means you're not just taking the softball ideas, you're working on the hard balls, because that's a baseball reference. You're willing to miss. Otherwise, if you can't fail, you're going to take really easy articles, and then you end up with, like, not exciting things on the internet. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
So it sounds like if there's only 5 people on the team, y'all must be very scrappy, which is good. But I was wondering, do you ever user test these, like, graphs and visuals externally, and not just like internally with the team?
I think each individual author has their own, like, process. Like, some people will user test with their significant others or their friends. If you're doing a really important piece that requires external feedback, you're almost testing with that expert.
Yeah.
But I think we mostly rely on the internal team to give hypothetical reader feedback. I will also say, if you're a UX tester, getting real candid feedback from real people UX testing your site is hard. And I think we've trained the team to be good testers because they know how to give candid feedback. I'll often show something to someone and they like me so much they don't tell me anything negative, and I'm like, well, that was a huge waste of time, right? So we could, like, recruit people and do, like, the whole objective thing, and then it's like, are they the people that we want to read it? And so we're trying to use ourselves as guinea pigs, but that also has a lot of drawbacks because we're not objective, and we understand charts better than the layperson. So I don't know, that's us. It could definitely be different or better. That's what we do right now.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because, like, I mean, this makes sense to me, but as you said, like, sometimes you have, like, this big thing and you kind of, like, scale it back. And so I was wondering if, like, any of that was influenced by, like, any external.
Usually in work in process. And the other thing is we have a Slack channel that's just called Work in Process, and that's like a mini version of, like, the weekly meeting. And I am, like, overboard in that channel. I just publish everything every day. Like, every hour I'll just, like, push screenshots and then say, hey, does this make sense? And everyone will be like, I have no idea what that is. And sometimes it's because I haven't finished the chart, and I have to, like, preface what they're saying with the idea that it's not done yet. But I can get some signal early on. So we're constantly, I'm at least, some people, not everyone's like this, but is pushing to that channel and trying to pull feedback out of the team on a more regular basis.
Well, I'd love to just wrap up by hearing you talk a little bit about your background and how the pudding came to be.
So the pudding is like V2 of another site that I started called Polygraph. And basically what happened was I had quit my job in consulting and did a sabbatical where I basically wanted to teach myself how to code. And let's see, so think about 2014. So what happened was I basically was reading the Natural Language Toolkit book, the O'Reilly book, and there was a section in there about counting the number of unique words in a corpus, which I thought was like, oh, that's really clever. And at the time I had been playing around with lyrics data, and I had this data set from Rap Genius on basically all the lyrics of every artist in their catalog. So I had put together this idea with another editorial organization that shall not be named, basically made a thing for them that was on rappers ranked by the size of their vocabulary. And then it ended up getting leaked because I was sending it to all my friends. And the other editorial publication pulled out because they were like, oh, it's on the internet now. But over the next few days, it ended up getting a lot of press. And I think it hit like several million views. And I was like, oh, this is way better than doing consulting. So came back to my consulting gig, quit that job, and then did a 3-month stint at the School for Poetic Computation, which is still going today. So it's a really, really cool program. You get to work with Zach Lieberman, who's like the most amazing generative coder out there. And that program, I think, helped hone my JavaScript skills. And then while I was doing that, I was working on an article with Spotify on the most timeless music. The idea was like, okay, if we took the music from the 50s and 60s and 70s, then looked at how popular that music is today on Spotify, does that align with what was popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when it comes to Billboard? So like the Single Ladies of 1963, is that still popular today? And ended up publishing that article as well. But instead of putting it on my personal site, which I had done with the Rapper project, I just decided to start a URL called poly-graph.co, which was $9.99, and then just put it on there. And I was like, oh, this is way better than putting it on my personal site. There was a lot of benefits of that. Having other people come into the fold, being able to collaborate easier. It's like hard to collaborate on mdaniels.com. So ended up publishing there. That did really, really well as well. And then just other articles started getting posted and working with other brands. And then eventually we were working we were doing enough client work, we being myself, that it was weird to publish editorial articles under the same name as doing client work. So we decided to take Polygraph and make that an agency, and then create a new entity called The Pudding last January. In 2017, that would just be editorial. So that's like the origin story. And then we're here today publishing brewery articles. So yeah, and then we're basically trying to make this a real thing. I don't know, we're applying for grants and make it like a self-sustaining editorial publication. We have a Patreon account if you want to be a patron. All the patrons get to see the stuff before it publishes. We're coming up with other perks, but we also have like a dedicated Slack channel where you can like ask us questions, or we post things every so often that we think are cool. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Matt.